I'm standing in what used to be my childhood bedroom, watching my stepmother Patricia throw my belongings into garbage bags like I'm some kind of unwanted tenant she's finally evicting. The smell of her expensive perfume mixed with the musty scent of cardboard boxes fills the air, and I can hear her muttering under her breath about how she's finally getting her house back. Today is my 18th birthday, and instead of cake and celebration, I'm getting kicked out of the only home I've ever known. The irony isn't lost on me that the woman who spent the last 5 years telling everyone what a devoted stepmother she was is now treating me like I'm nothing more than an inconvenience she can finally dispose of legally. Move faster, Sarah. Patricia snaps, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her phone screen as she texts someone, probably her sister Linda, telling her the good news that she's finally gotten rid of me. I want you out before dinner. I'm having the Hendersons over, and I don't want them asking awkward questions about why you're still here. Her voice has that familiar edge of disgust that I've grown accustomed to over the years, the same tone she uses when she talks about the neighbor's dog that keeps digging up her prize-winning roses. She's wearing her favorite cream-colored blazer, the one she always puts on when she wants to look respectable and put together, but I can see the satisfaction in her eyes as she watches me stuff my life into these cheap plastic bags. The house feels different now, cold and unwelcoming in a way it never did when Dad was alive. 6 months ago, this was still my home, filled with the warmth of my father's laughter and the smell of his weekend pancakes. Now it feels like a museum of memories that Patricia is eager to erase, starting with me. I can see her already mentally redecorating my room, probably turning it into the home office she's always wanted, or maybe a guest room for her precious daughter Jessica, who visits twice a year and treats this place like a luxury hotel. The family photos that used to line the hallway have been replaced with Patricia's interior design magazine spreads, and even the kitchen has been scrubbed clean of any trace of my father's presence. Let me take you back to how this nightmare began, because this story doesn't start with me being thrown out on my 18th birthday like some kind of legal formality. It starts 5 years ago, when my dad married Patricia thinking he was giving me a mother figure and himself a second chance at happiness. Dad was a good man, a contractor who built half the houses in our small Ohio town, and he genuinely believed that love could conquer anything, including Patricia's obvious disdain for his awkward, bookish daughter. I remember the wedding day so clearly, Dad looking happier than I'd seen him since Mom died when I was 7, and Patricia playing the role of the perfect stepmother, complete with a speech about how excited she was to have a daughter. The mask started slipping almost immediately after the honeymoon. It began with small things that Dad would never notice, but cut me deeply every single time. Patricia would forget to include me in family photos, or she'd cook elaborate dinners for herself and Dad while leaving me a sandwich or telling me to find something in the fridge. She had this way of making me feel invisible in my own home, like I was some kind of ghost haunting the house she was trying to make perfect. When Dad was around, she'd put on this elaborate show of maternal concern, asking about my homework and my friends, but the moment he left for work, her true personality would emerge like a snake shedding its skin. The real torture was in the details that Dad never saw because he was working 60-hour weeks to pay for Patricia's expensive taste in everything from furniture to clothes to vacations. She would rearrange my room while I was at school, throwing away things she deemed childish or inappropriate, including a stuffed elephant my mom had given me that I treasured above everything else. When I cried about it, she told Dad I was being dramatic and ungrateful, and somehow she convinced him that I needed to grow up and stop clinging to the past. She had this incredible ability to twist every situation so that I looked like the problem child and she looked like the patient, long-suffering stepmother dealing with a troubled teenager who couldn't accept her father's new happiness. The psychological warfare escalated during my sophomore year of high school when Patricia decided that my academic achievements were somehow threatening her narrative of being the sophisticated one in the house. I was getting straight A's and had been accepted into the National Honor Society, accomplishments that should have made any parent proud, but Patricia saw them as opportunities to undermine me in front of Dad. She would intercept my report cards and present them to Dad with comments like, "Sarah's doing well, but I'm worried she's becoming too obsessed with grades and not developing socially. Maybe we should consider getting her some counseling to help her with her obvious anxiety issues." She had this insidious way of turning my strengths into weaknesses, making my father worry that his bookish daughter was somehow damaged or antisocial. The holidays were particularly brutal because they gave Patricia a stage to perform her perfect stepmother act while simultaneously making my life miserable. During Thanksgiving of my junior year, she invited her entire extended family to our house, including her judgmental mother who had never liked Dad and made it clear that she thought he was beneath her daughter's standards. Patricia spent weeks preparing for this dinner, turning our home into a magazine-worthy showcase, but when it came to including me in any of the preparations, I was treated like hired help rather than family. She would have me polishing silver and scrubbing floors while she got her hair and nails done, all while telling her relatives on the phone about how she was teaching Sarah valuable life skills and responsibility. The night before Thanksgiving, I was in the kitchen until midnight helping Patricia prepare side dishes and desserts, my hands raw from peeling potatoes and my feet aching from standing for hours. When her family arrived the next day, she introduced me as David's daughter rather than using any term that suggested I was part of her family unit. Throughout the dinner, she would make subtle digs disguised as concern, telling her mother things like, "Sarah's been struggling to find her place since she became a teenager. You know how hard it can be for children who lose their mothers so young to accept new family dynamics." Meanwhile, she would praise Jessica effusively whenever her daughter bothered to call during the meal, going on and on about Jessica's sorority activities and internship opportunities. The financial manipulation was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Patricia's psychological campaign against me. Dad had always been generous with money, making sure I had everything I needed for school and activities, but Patricia slowly began controlling every aspect of our household finances. She convinced Dad that they needed to budget more carefully and that I should learn financial responsibility by earning money for things that had previously been provided without question. Suddenly, I was expected to pay for my own school supplies, clothes, and even contribute to groceries if I wanted specific foods that Patricia deemed unnecessary luxuries. Meanwhile, she was spending hundreds of dollars on spa treatments and shopping trips with her friends, justifying these expenses as necessary for her mental health and their marriage. When I got a part-time job at the local bookstore to pay for these new expenses, Patricia found ways to make even that a source of conflict and control. She would schedule family obligations during my work hours and then guilt me about choosing work over family, or she would criticize the job itself, telling Dad that she was worried about me working with all those strange customers, and suggesting that the bookstore wasn't a suitable environment for a young woman. She managed to make my attempts at independence look like rebellion and my financial necessity look like selfishness, all while positioning herself as the reasonable adult trying to guide a difficult teenager. The academic sabotage reached its peak during my senior year when I was applying for college scholarships. Patricia had convinced Dad that I should focus on community college first to save money and stay close to family, but I had my heart set on the state university where I'd been offered a partial academic scholarship. When letters started arriving from colleges, Patricia would intercept them and present them to Dad with commentary about how unrealistic my expectations were and how much stress I was putting on the family finances. She managed to lose several important scholarship application deadlines by forgetting to give me forms that had arrived in the mail, and when I confronted her about it, she acted hurt and confused, telling Dad that I was paranoid and accusatory toward someone who was only trying to help. The final months before Dad's death were the worst because Patricia sensed that her control was slipping as I got older and more aware of her manipulation tactics. She began what I can only describe as a scorched earth campaign to turn Dad against me, using every conversation as an opportunity to plant seeds of doubt about my character and gratitude. She would tell him that I was secretive and disrespectful, that I never appreciated anything he did for me, and that she was worried I was going down a dark path because I spent so much time reading and studying. She painted my academic focus as antisocial behavior and my growing independence as ingratitude, creating a narrative where she was the loving stepmother trying to save a troubled teenager from herself, while I was the ungrateful daughter who couldn't see how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much. Everything changed the day I turned 18, not just because Patricia finally had the legal right to kick me out, but because something inside me snapped when I watched her throwing my belongings around like they were garbage. Standing there in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life she was eager to erase, I realized that I had spent 5 years allowing this woman to make me feel like I was the problem, like I was somehow defective or unworthy of basic human decency. The sound of my books hitting the bottom of those plastic bags was like a wake-up call, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than hurt and confusion. I felt anger, pure and righteous, burning in my chest like a flame that had finally found oxygen. "You know what, Patricia?" I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I'm actually glad you're doing this. I'm glad you're finally showing your true colors instead of hiding behind that fake concerned stepmother act." She stopped mid-throw, a framed photo of me and Dad from my 16th birthday still clutched in her manicured fingers, and I could see the shock in her eyes that I was finally talking back after years of silent submission. "I've spent 5 years thinking there was something wrong with me, wondering why nothing I did was ever good enough for you, but now I realize the problem was never me. The problem is that you're a bitter, jealous woman who couldn't stand that my father loved someone more than he loved you." The words poured out of me like water through a broken dam, years of suppressed frustration and hurt finally finding their voice. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, rage, and then that familiar calculating look she got when she was trying to figure out how to spin a situation to her advantage. "How dare you speak to me that way in my house?" she hissed, setting the photo down with exaggerated care. "Your father would be ashamed of the disrespectful little brat you've become. This is exactly why you need to leave. You clearly have no appreciation for everything I've sacrificed for this family." But for the first time, her manipulation tactics felt powerless against me because I could finally see them for what they were. "Your sacrifices?" I laughed, and it felt good to laugh at her for once instead of being the target of her cruelty. "What sacrifices, Patricia? Spending my father's money on spa treatments while making me pay for my own school supplies? Throwing away my mother's belongings while redecorating the house to look like something from one of your magazines? Or maybe you mean the sacrifice of pretending to care about me whenever Dad was around while treating me like a servant the rest of the time." I could see her composure cracking as I systematically dismantled the narrative she'd spent years constructing, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating to finally speak my truth. The phone call that came an hour later changed everything in ways that neither Patricia nor I could have anticipated. I was in the living room, stuffing the last of my belongings into bags while Patricia watched from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, when the landline rang with that sharp, insistent tone that somehow always signals important news. Patricia answered with her usual saccharine telephone voice. "Mitchell residence," Patricia speaking, but I watched her expression shift from pleasant expectation to confusion, and then to something that looked almost like fear. Yes, this is Mrs. Mitchell. What do you mean there's been a development with the estate? I thought everything was settled months ago. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I could read Patricia's body language like a book after 5 years of studying her moods and reactions. Her free hand started fidgeting with her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger in that nervous habit she had whenever something wasn't going according to her carefully laid plans. I don't understand, she kept saying, her voice getting higher and more strained with each repetition. David never mentioned anything about additional provisions. Are you absolutely certain this document is legitimate? By the time she hung up the phone, her face had gone completely pale, and for the first time since I'd known her, Patricia looked genuinely rattled instead of perfectly composed. What was that about? I asked, not because I particularly cared about Patricia's problems, but because the fear in her eyes was so intense that it made me curious despite myself. She stared at me for a long moment, like she was seeing me for the first time, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head as she tried to process whatever information she'd just received. That was Dad's lawyer, she said slowly, each word seeming to cost her tremendous effort. Apparently, there's been some kind of oversight in the estate settlement. He wants to meet with both of us tomorrow morning to discuss some additional provisions that weren't included in the original will reading. The way she said both of us made it clear that whatever these provisions were, they involved me in a way that Patricia had definitely not anticipated. The law office of Henderson, Mills and Associates looked exactly like every lawyer's office you've ever seen in movies. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and that particular smell of old paper and furniture polish that seems to cling to places where important documents change people's lives. Patricia sat rigidly in the chair next to me, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that made her tap her fingernails against her purse in an anxious rhythm. Mr. Henderson, Dad's longtime lawyer and family friend, looked uncomfortable as he shuffled through a stack of papers, clearing his throat several times before finally meeting our eyes. Ladies, I want to apologize for the confusion yesterday. It seems that David prepared 2 versions of his will, and we initially processed the earlier version by mistake. What do you mean, 2 versions? Patricia's voice had that sharp edge it got when she felt like she was losing control of a situation, and I could see her knuckles turning white as she gripped the arms of her chair. Mr. Henderson pulled out a thick document with Dad's signature clearly visible at the bottom, along with the signatures of 2 witnesses I recognized as Dad's work colleagues. This is the final version, dated just 3 months before David's passing. It contains some very specific provisions regarding Sarah's inheritance that weren't included in the version we read 6 months ago. He handed Patricia a copy of the document, and I watched her eyes skim the pages with increasing panic, her face going from pale to completely white as she read. I don't understand, Patricia whispered, but her voice carried the tone of someone who understood perfectly and couldn't believe what she was seeing. Mr. Henderson turned to me with an expression that was part apologetic and part congratulatory. Sarah, your father was very concerned about your future, particularly your college education and long-term financial security. This final will establishes a substantial trust fund in your name, funded by the life insurance policy he increased significantly in the months before his death. He handed me my own copy of the document, and as I read the numbers, I felt like the room was spinning around me. The trust fund contained over $300,000 specifically designated for my education, living expenses, and future needs, with the stipulation that I would gain full access to the principal amount on my 25th birthday. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. Dad had also left me a 50% ownership stake in the house, meaning that Patricia couldn't make any major decisions about the property, including selling it or forcing me to leave, without my explicit consent. Furthermore, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice getting stronger as he saw the understanding dawn in my eyes. David included a clause stating that if Sarah is removed from the family home before the age of 21 without her consent, the house ownership transfers entirely to her, and the trust fund penalties that would normally apply for early withdrawal are waived. Patricia's reaction was immediate and devastating to watch. The woman who had spent 5 years making me feel small and powerless was suddenly faced with the reality that her entire plan had been built on a foundation of lies. "This can't be legal," she stammered, her voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. "David would never have done this without telling me. We discussed everything together. This has to be some kind of mistake or fraud." But Mr. Henderson shook his head firmly, pulling out additional documentation that proved beyond any doubt that Dad had made these changes deliberately and with full legal counsel. "Actually, Patricia, David was very specific about keeping these provisions confidential until after Sarah turned 18. He was concerned about family dynamics and wanted to ensure that Sarah's inheritance remained protected regardless of any changes in the household situation." The lawyer's words hit Patricia like physical blows, and I could see her mentally calculating what this meant for her future. She had assumed that once I turned 18, she would have complete control of Dad's estate and could live the wealthy widow lifestyle she'd always dreamed of. Instead, she was discovering that Dad had seen through her manipulation and had taken steps to protect me from exactly the situation I was currently facing. The most beautiful part was watching Patricia realize that her cruelty toward me had triggered the very clause that would cost her everything. By kicking me out on my 18th birthday, she had activated the provision that transferred complete ownership of the house to me and freed up my trust fund for immediate use. "So what you're telling me," I said slowly, wanting to make sure I understood the delicious irony of the situation, "is that by forcing me to leave, Patricia has actually given me complete control of the house and access to my inheritance?" Mr. Henderson nodded with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "That's correct, Sarah. As of yesterday, when you were asked to leave the family home, you became the sole owner of the property and all its contents." The silence in that office was deafening as the full weight of the situation settled over all three of us. Patricia sat there looking like she'd been hit by a truck, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her as she realized that her 5-year campaign of psychological warfare had backfired spectacularly. I felt a mixture of emotions: grief for my father who had loved me enough to protect me even after death, vindication after years of being made to feel worthless, and yes, a deep satisfaction at seeing Patricia finally face consequences for her cruelty. "I think," I said, standing up and smoothing down my dress with hands that were surprisingly steady, "that Patricia needs to start packing her belongings. After all, she's no longer welcome in my house." Walking back into that house as its owner instead of an unwanted guest was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Patricia followed behind me in stunned silence, probably still trying to process how completely her world had been turned upside down in the span of 24 hours. The garbage bags that had contained my belongings the day before were still sitting by the front door, but now they represented something entirely different, evidence of the moment when Patricia's greed and cruelty had cost her everything she thought she'd won. I picked up my books and clothes with a sense of reverence, not because they were valuable, but because they represented my survival through 5 years of psychological warfare. "Sarah, please," Patricia said, her voice smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. "Surely we can work something out. This house has been my home too. Your father would want us to find a way to live together as a family." But her words rang hollow after years of her making it clear that she'd never considered me family, and I found that I had no sympathy left for the woman who had systematically tried to destroy my self-worth. "You're right about one thing, Patricia," I replied, turning to face her with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "Dad would want his family to be together in this house. But you made it very clear over the last 5 years that I was never part of your definition of family. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal paperwork, moving arrangements, and the strange experience of watching Patricia pack up her life while I reclaimed mine. She tried various tactics to change my mind: tears, anger, threats, and even attempts to paint herself as the victim of a cruel teenage vendetta. But I had learned too much about manipulation to fall for her games, and besides, I had something now that I'd never had before: the concrete proof that my father had loved me and had seen Patricia for exactly what she was. The house slowly transformed back into a home as Patricia's cold, magazine-perfect decorations were replaced by warmth and personality, including some of Dad's belongings that she had hidden away in the attic. Today, 2 years later, I'm a sophomore at the State University, studying psychology with a focus on family dynamics and emotional abuse. Funny how life experiences can shape your career path. The house is still mine, though I've converted Patricia's old master's suite into a study and art studio, spaces that feed my soul in ways that Patricia's pristine showcase rooms never could. I think about Dad often, especially when I'm making his weekend pancakes or working in the garden he loved so much, and I'm filled with gratitude for a man who loved me enough to see the future clearly and protect me from it. Sometimes people ask me if I ever feel guilty about what happened to Patricia, and the answer is simple: you can't feel guilty about consequences that someone brought entirely upon themselves. My father's will didn't just give me financial security and a home, it gave me something far more valuable. It gave me the knowledge that I was loved, protected, and valued by the person whose opinion mattered most, and that knowledge has been the foundation for building a life filled with genuine relationships and authentic happiness.